Hi, I'm Alice Hoal, and this is my stepping story. 2 years ago, I and my husband Dave were getting ready to move to Florida to begin our retirement. Dave had recently been laid off and was having a hard time finding another job, so he decided he just wanted to be retired. So we bought a house on the Gulf Coast, and we sold our house here in Collierville, where we had lived for the past 25 years and had raised 2 wonderful children. And I had left my job here at the preschool after 22 years as a teacher. We had just about finished packing up our lives here in Collierville. However, as moving day grew closer, Dave's anxiety began to grow. Dave had suffered from anxiety and depression for many years and had chosen to stop taking his medication several months earlier. The worst times for Dave were when big life changes were occurring. But in the past, he had always been able to pull himself out of these dark places. But this time was different. I knew Dave was in trouble, even though he refused to seek help. Then one morning, I awoke to find my husband in the backyard, intending to harm himself. I pleaded with him not to do this, and I called for help. Soon afterwards, we heard a voice commanding Dave to put down his weapon. I was about 12 feet away from Dave, and I could see that his weapon was lowered, but he did not immediately comply with the command. Instead, he turned from looking at me to looking in the direction of the voice. Seconds later, Dave was shot and killed. It was the last thing I ever expected, and I did not think I would recover from it. The first person I called was my Stephen minister, and she came right away to be with me, as did Reverend David and Reverend Deborah. The first few days after, I couldn't pray. But the second day, I did open up my Bible app to see what the verse of the day was, and it was Psalm 68:5. A father to the fatherless, a defender of widows, is God in his holy dwelling. And it took me a few seconds to realize that I was now a widow. The morning of Dave's memorial service, my sister-in-law and I were sitting on my patio when we spotted a small rainbow in the sky right in front of us. Now, it hadn't been raining. The sun was out, but there were some clouds in the sky, and between 2 clouds was this little rainbow. And it only lasted a few minutes, and then it was gone. But it did give me some comfort. My children and I were so overwhelmed by all the care and concern our church family showed us. I know that those first few weeks, we got through them through everybody's prayers. And I have 2 very, very dear friends who called or texted me every day for over a year. And I knew they did this to make sure that I was still alive, and I'm very thankful to them. Elizabeth Gilbert, the author of the memoir Eat, Pray, and Love, wrote, "Grief is a force of energy that cannot be controlled or predicted. Grief does not obey your plans or your wishes. Grief will do whatever it wants to you whenever it wants to. In that regard, grief has a lot in common with love." I found that my grief encompassed not just sadness, but fear, anger, regret, and guilt. Lots of guilt. The worst times were when things I had prayed for, things that I thought should have happened, didn't. It was then that I felt abandoned by God. But I realized that God had actually prepared me for this, because before we moved to Collierville and joined this church, I didn't know very much about the Bible. But after taking years of disciple classes and Bible studies, if there's one thing I learned, it is that God loves me, and He is faithful. And so I really knew that God had not abandoned me, even though it felt like that. I realized what I was lacking was trust. It's easy to say you trust in the Lord when things are going your way. It's a little harder to do so when they're not. Several months ago, I had a dream. Now, I don't remember my dreams hardly ever, but in this one, I woke up, I got out of bed, and I walked into the kitchen and turned the light on like I always do, and there was Dave, just standing there in the kitchen. And he was young, and he was fit, and he was so happy. He was so happy, he was giddy with excitement. And I ran over to him and I kept grabbing his arms to make sure he was real. And I asked him, did he go to heaven? And he answered, well, I'm here with you now. When I woke up, it took me a few seconds to realize that had been a dream, because it seemed so real, and it still does. Shortly after Dave's death, I bought this plaque, and on it is Romans 8:28. For we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. And I have that in my bedroom so I can look at it every morning to remind myself that God does love me, he is working for my good, and I still do have a purpose. I believe Dave has fulfilled his purpose here on earth, and now he's being rewarded. And I hope someday I will be too.